All right, so this morning, I think you guys are currently in a study of Ezekiel. Is that right? So I haven't prepared anything on Ezekiel, so we're not going to talk about Ezekiel today. We're going to take a little break, and we're going to go through 1 Samuel chapters 2 and 3. There is a little bit of background knowledge that would probably be helpful for this, which is all found in chapter 1. I'm going to read through chapter 1 just so that you have that in your head, and then we can start talking about how to be a rotten parent. I wrote this devotion when I was down in Tucson, Arizona, which is where I served my vicar year. And this was, I think it was exactly 2 months after my son Matthias was born. And so it seemed pretty fitting to talk about all the mistakes that I might make in the coming years. So we'll read 1 Samuel chapter 1. If you want to follow along, if you want to listen, that's just fine. We won't ask any questions about it, but just so you can have that knowledge in your head. The birth of Samuel. There was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zophite from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeroam, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. He had 2 wives. One was called Hannah, and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. Year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh, where Hophni and Phinehas, the 2 sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord. Those names you'll really need to keep in your mind for especially chapter 2. Hophni and Phinehas, they are the sons of Eli, who was the priest at the temple. Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, and the Lord closed her womb. And because the Lord had closed her womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her until she wept and wouldn't eat. Elkanah, her husband, would say to her, "Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons?" Once, when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on a chair by the doorstep of the Lord's temple. In bitterness of soul, Hannah wept much and prayed to the Lord. And she made a vow, saying, "O Lord Almighty, if you will only look upon your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head." As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, but her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought that she was drunk, and said to her, "How long will you keep on getting drunk? Get rid of your wine." It seems kind of weird. I suppose maybe if you went out into a public place and were kneeling on the floor in Walmart and your lips were just moving, somebody might think the same thing. However, she was in church, and this is the priest talking to her. I'm not sure why he first jumped to the conclusion of, "Oh, she must be drunk. She's praying." So she explains, "No, not so, my lord." Hannah replied, "I'm a woman who is deeply troubled. I've not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I've been praying here out of my great anguish and grief." Eli answered, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." She said, "May your servant find favor in your eyes." And then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Early the next morning they arose and worshipped before the Lord, and then went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah lay with Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, "Because I asked the Lord for him." When the man Elkanah went up with all his family to offer the annual sacrifice to the Lord and to fulfill his vow, Hannah did not go. She said to her husband, "After the boy is weaned, I'll take him and present him before the Lord, and he will live there always." "Do what seems best to you," Elkanah, her husband, told her. "Stay here until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord make good his word." So the woman stayed at home and nursed her son until she had weaned him. After he was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. When they had slaughtered the bull, they brought the boy to Eli, and she said to him, "As surely as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord." And he worshiped the Lord there. So that is, like I said, I'm not going to ask any questions about that chapter. But before we get into chapter 2, I don't know if I even really introduced myself, but my name is Justus Mckenzie. I'm a senior at the seminary. I mentioned this, I spent my vicar year last year down in Tucson, Arizona with my wife Stephanie, and we had our first son Matthias in November, so his first birthday is actually coming up. That's my sister Anna, by the way. I don't know if you've all been able to meet her, but she's been coming here for the past couple weeks. I tipped her onto this place because I like Pastor Cuck a lot, and so I told her, hey, her and her husband just moved up from Dallas, and so they were looking for a church home, and maybe found it. We'll see. I know that you have a seminary professor as a former seminary professor as your pastor, and you've had several seminarians come in and preach and teach and all of that stuff. But just before we get into it, are there any questions that you guys have about things at the seminary, the process, anything like that? Yeah. That's why I bring this up, is because it's exactly like this. Yeah. Yep. Just got to wave goodbye to everybody and follow Jesus, right? Yeah. What year are you in? My last year, senior year. Yep. So 8 years in, ready to be 8 years done. It's a fantastic place. It's really one of those. Have you ever been to the seminary? It's maybe, a 30-minute drive, 40-minute drive from here, something like that, 30. It's really an amazing campus. Incredibly blessed to have a place like that. It's one of those places that you walk there and onto the campus, and you just immediately feel empty-handed if you don't have an open Bible in your hands. Like, it just is one of those, and just being surrounded by men, professors, and students who have dedicated their lives to serving their Savior is just incredibly encouraging and humbling. All right, awesome. That was a test. We're not here to talk about me. We're here to talk about the Bible, so you fail. No, I'm kidding. We'll get into chapter 2. So we're talking about how to be a rotten parent. Might be a little bit strongly worded. Today is a day that consciences may be struck. I'm sure that down the line when I recall this Bible study, my conscience will be struck when I'm thinking about the mistakes that I'm making with raising my son. Pray to God for forgiveness and know that He grants it to us because of what Christ has done for us. But we're going to take it in kind of smaller chunks. We're going to try to get through all of chapter 2 today. I know that we already started kind of late. If we're really pushing on time, then we'll just cut it off. But we'll try to get through chapter 2 because there's the graph on the back I'd really like to get to and talk about. Are there any questions on chapter 1, by the way, before we dive into chapter 2? Okay, then we're going to read verses 1 through 11 of chapter 2, and then we'll start asking our questions. So this is immediately after Hannah learns that she had conceived and had her son and has presented him to the Lord. And it's after all of this, which is interesting. I mean, God finally blessed her with a son after being mocked and ridiculed by her husband's other wife for not having kids. And she has a son, and she gives him up to God. Like, He finally blesses her with the thing that she wanted the most, and she's like, here it is, God. I mean, what an example of the text from today for the sermon, right? God, this is already yours. This is your son. I'm giving him back to you to serve you all the days of his life. Such a cool example. And then she goes on and she says this prayer or this song in chapter 2. Then Hannah prayed and said, "My heart rejoices in the Lord. In the Lord, my horn is lifted high. My mouth boasts over my enemies, for I delight in your deliverance. There is no one holy like the Lord. There is no one besides you. There is no rock like our God. Do not keep talking so proudly, or let your mouth speak such arrogance, for the Lord is a God who knows, and by him deeds are weighed. The bows of the warriors are broken, but those who stumbled are armed with strength. Those who are full hire themselves out for food, but those who are hungry hunger no more. She who was barren has borne 7 children, but she who has had many sons pines away. The Lord brings death and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and raises up. The Lord sends poverty and wealth. He humbles and he exalts. He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap. He seats them with princes and has them inherit a throne of honor. For the foundations of the earth are the Lord's. Upon them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his saints, but the wicked will be silenced in darkness. It is not by strength that one prevails. Those who oppose the Lord will be shattered. He will thunder against them from heaven. The Lord will judge to the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. And then Elkanah went home to Ramah, but the boy ministered before the Lord under Eli the priest. So the first point on your sheet under those verses is, can you just take a shot at summarizing what we just read? Doesn't have to be perfect, or just some points that you gleaned from it, or just the overarching theme.
Well, she praises God, first of all, for giving her a son.
Yeah.
She prayed for him.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point, because what was her prayer in chapter 1? Yeah. God, I am the humbled right now. I am the lowly in spirit. I'm the one who's laying in the ash heap because I don't have a kid and my husband's other wife is mocking me for it. And I don't feel complete until I have this, God. But notice, she does not forget God when she finally gets the blessing. Right? How often it can be really easy for us as Christians to come to God when things are really looking down in the dumps and, oh man, now God, I need you. But then to just forget as soon as God actually grants you either that blessing or one even better than the one you were asking for, right? But not Hannah. She comes back and she prays thanks to God. Yeah, you had something.
So throughout this, I think she's reminding that the world may think we've got things lined up this way, but you know what? God's going to call it audible there. Because maybe you think you're barren, you're going to have kids. Maybe you think you're poor, you're going to be rich. You think that you're not worthy, you're going to end up. The point is that we think we know what is, but God says, here's the real story.
Yep. Yeah, no, and that's one of the points from the text from today, too, is you look at a guy with the status of the rich young ruler, and it's like he has an entourage with him. He's got every possession you could possibly want at that time. He was this Jewish ruler who was the overseer of a synagogue, He's got everything going for him. And yet he's the one who walks away from God sad because he couldn't give up those things. But then someone like this, like people who are poor and someone who's just like broken down in their spirit, this is what God says he desires. A broken and contrite heart, Lord. You're not going to despise that. That's the sacrifices we give to our God. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like Joyce was saying, it starts off as a prayer of thanksgiving, and then it gets into who God is and what he can do for us. And it kind of points to your text this morning. With God, all things are possible. So you have a woman who was barren, she could give birth to a son.
Right.
He can uplift our spirits when we're not feeling super strong in our faith.
Right. Yeah, and how many times? Yeah, go ahead.
This is pretty similar to the prayer of Mary that Mckenzie
Thank you.
Luke chapter 1.
Yep.
But the other thing is she never really, as far as I can see, she never really says in this prayer, thank you for giving me a son. Is that even in here? If I were
Yeah.
thank
So if you take a look at verse 5, fantastic insight, by the way, that this is very similar to the Song of Mary, because it totally is. The overarching theme of this is God brings down the proud and he lifts up the humbled. That's the whole summary of this song and the whole summary of the Song of Mary, right? But if you look at verse 5, she says, those who were full hire themselves out for food, because they have no food anymore. But those who were hungry, they hunger no more. And then she talks about her having the son. She who was barren has borne 7 children, but she who has had many sons pines away. So that's her inclusion of her having the son. Now, we actually don't learn until a little bit later in the chapter that actually the Lord opened up Hannah's womb even after having Samuel. So she had the one son. She sings this song, and then she has 5 more. Now, I'm at the seminary, and we don't do a whole lot of math, but that does not equal 7. That's 6, right? So, is she talking about herself? She's talking about herself, and she's thanking God in verse 5 for her son, not even knowing that she was going to have 5 more. She had just had her first son, and she was giving him up to the Lord, and then she sings this prayer. But she was so fulfilled at having this one son. We learn in the book of Ruth that in this time, having 7 sons was looked at the number of completeness. Like once you've gotten that, like you are the top of the food chain when it comes to childbearing. She didn't. Far from it at this point. She only had 1 son at this point. She still hadn't had her other 5 kids, but she felt so fulfilled that God listened to her prayer that she's like, I'm complete. If God doesn't give me anything else, this is great. And I just gave him back to God. And you can see just the sense of fulfillment that she has in that. So, yeah, thank you for bringing that point up. Anything else on? Yeah, in the back.
I was just curious, and maybe perhaps the women can answer the question better. When would he have been weaned? How old would this child have been?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's definitely a cultural thing, too. I mean, a lot of kids can be weaned at 3 months and then go on to formula, right?
They're eating solid foods?
Right.
Then the priest has to take care of them and change diapers?
That's a good question, too. The best guess, and I could absolutely look into this more, or since I'm not going to be here next week, tell Pastor Cuck to look into this more. But usually they'd probably be breastfeeding a little bit longer at this time, just because that's the source of food. I mean, and if the kid doesn't have teeth or if he's not handling solids, how else is he going to eat? And it's not even that uncommon today for a kid to go to 2 years. But you could probably expect around that time, 2 to 3 years old, should be pretty trained at that point because the moms were always home training the kids. And so if she's going to present them to the temple, yeah. Don't quote me on that. I'll step away and say that's my opinion. Okay, I'm not sure because it doesn't tell us. Yeah.
I have it known, I'm sure I got this out of the People's Bible,
Great.
5 or 6 years old. So I'm sure I got that out of the People's Bible.
That's a fantastic resource, and whoever wrote that knows way more than I do about the age of weaning. Yeah.
I hesitate to read too much into this, but since we're going to be kind of talking about Eli's failures as a parent,
Mm-hmm.
certainly Hannah wasn't a perfect parent either, but as far as what Scripture records, there's positive things. And so reading between the lines, those first few years, whether it was Moses being with his parents, in Egypt, or Samuel in this case, and then seeing the contrast between Samuel and Eli's sons, it just drives home the importance of those first few
Yes.
years.
Yeah.
Those first few years of life of those little children, because God doesn't come right out and say it's because they had these first solid years with their Christian parents that we see them faithful later on.
Yeah.
But our application as parents of young children would be, wow, this is important these first few years.
You are absolutely right. And actually, because you brought that up, and because time is already ticking away, we're gonna read the rest of the chapter, and then we'll come back to some of the questions. But I want to come right back to what you just said. So we'll look at the example that Eli gave as a parent, and please don't forget that question. So what verses are we? Verse 12. So we'll read from verse 12 to the end of the chapter. Now we hear about Eli and his parenting. Eli's sons were wicked men. The priest's sons. You never heard of a pastor's kid going off the walls or anything, have you? I can say that because I am one. Eli's sons were wicked men. They had no regard for the Lord. Now it was the practice of the priests with the people that whenever anyone offered a sacrifice, and while the meat was being boiled, the servant of the priest would come with a three-pronged fork in his hand. He would plunge it into the pan or the kettle or cauldron or pot, whatever it was, and the priest would take for himself whatever the fork brought up. So this is how the priests got their food. Okay, people came to make their sacrifices. God said, you guys don't get to inherit any land or anything like that. So there's no way for them to provide for themselves except for through the sacrifices that were brought to the church. And this is why pastors, like the way that they're paid is through the offerings, because you don't get another allotment. You are the ones who are bringing my gospel to the people, and so you get from... But there was a very specific way that they did this. It was almost like casting lots-ish, but they would literally take a three-pronged fork, like a pitchfork, if you can picture, and they just, boom, right into the water. You can't see what you're going to poke because it's boiling, and then you pull up, and whatever it is that comes up, that's yours and your family's food. So that's the way that God set it up to be. And this is how, continuing on in verse 14, this is how they treated all the Israelites who came to Shiloh. Good. But even before the fat was burned, the servant of the priest would come and say to the man who was sacrificing, give the priest some meat to roast. He will not accept boiled meat from you, but only raw. I think we can maybe understand why they would be doing this, because honestly, boiling a steak is not anywhere near as tasty as grilling it, right? Okay. And boiling it, that'll cook the fat off faster too, which is where most of the flavor is. And so you can see the selfish tendencies that they have already. If the man said to him, though, let the fat burn up first. Why? Why do we want the fat to burn up first? Yeah? Yeah, because that's what God told them to do. Like these are the offerings that people are bringing to their God, and God wants the first fruits, right? I want the best piece of everything you got. Whatever that first thing is off the top, that's mine. But these nasty priests' sons are coming in and they're saying, nope, we want the fat, we want to be able to grill it, we want whatever. So if the man said to him, let the fat burn up first and then take whatever you want, the servant would then answer, no, hand it over now. If you don't, I'll take it by force. Not a very good look for the priest and his sons. This sin of the young men was very great in the Lord's sight, for they were treating the Lord's offering with contempt. But Samuel, now we hear the contrast that you had just mentioned, but Samuel, he was ministering before the Lord, a boy wearing a linen ephod. Each year his mother made him a little robe and took it to him when she went up with her husband to offer the annual sacrifice. Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife, saying, may the Lord give you children by this woman to take the place of the one she prayed for and gave to the Lord. Then they would go home, and the Lord was gracious to Hannah. She conceived and gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. That's where the other 5 come from. Meanwhile, the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. Now Eli, who was very old, heard about everything his sons were doing to all Israel and how they slept with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. So not only are they taking the sacrifices from God before they're able to boil up and actually give to God, they're sleeping with the women who work at the church. Enough said. So he said to them, why do you do such things? This is Eli talking to his sons. Why do you do such things? I hear from all the people about these wicked deeds of yours. No, my sons. It is not a good report that I hear spreading among the Lord's people. If a man sins against another man, then God may mediate for him. But if a man sins against the Lord, who's going to intercede for him? His sons, however, did not listen to their father's rebuke, for it was the Lord's will to put them to death. And the boy Samuel continued to grow in stature and in favor with the Lord and with men. Now, a man of God came to Eli and said to him, this is what the Lord says, did I not clearly reveal myself to your father's house when they were in Egypt under Pharaoh? I chose your father out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to go up to my altar, to burn incense, and to wear an ephod in my presence. I also gave your father's house all the offerings made with fire by the Israelites. Why do you scorn my sacrifice and offering that I prescribed for my dwelling? Why do you honor your sons more than me by fattening yourselves on the choice parts of every offering made by my people Israel? Therefore the Lord, the God of Israel, declares, I promised that your house and your father's house would minister before me forever. But now the Lord declares, far be it from me. Those who honor me, I will honor, but those who despise me, I will despise, or we will be disdained. The time is coming when I will cut short your strength and the strength of your father's house, so that there will not be an old man in your family line, and you will see distress in my dwelling. Although good will be done to Israel in your family line, there will never be an old man. Every one of you that I do not cut off from my altar will be spared only to blind your eyes with tears and to grieve your heart. And all your descendants will die in the prime of life. And what happens to your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, will be assigned to you. They will both die on the same day. I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who will do according to what is in my heart and mind. I will firmly establish his house, and he will minister before my anointed one always. Then everyone left in your family line will come and bow down before him for a piece of silver and a crust of bread and plead, appoint me to some priestly office so I can have food to eat. Back to your question, or your comment. You had mentioned how well, Hannah must have done, maybe, presumably, in just those first couple of years. Do any of you know who Jordan Peterson is? Ever heard of him? He's kind of in the hot seat right now because he's up in Toronto in Canada. He was a tenured professor there, and he had refused to go along with a law that they actually have in Canada that you must call people by their preferred pronouns. And he said, if somebody came up to me and asked me to do that, I'd do it, but I'm not going to do it if the law forces me to. And so he's been on the hot seat for a couple years now. Anyway, he's a psychologist, and he, in one of his lectures, was commenting that as a parent, it is your job to make sure that your child is socially acceptable by the age of 4. That's pretty quick. By the age of 4. Now, can you think of any reasons why that's kind of the deadline? Okay, before they go to school and interact with other kids. Yep, that's one of them. Yeah, this is going to set the pattern for things. Yeah, this is going to set the pattern for things to come. And he basically said it's because if a kid isn't raised to be at least somewhat socially acceptable by the age of 4, they're going to start interacting with other kids. And if the other kids see that we don't want anything, kids are pretty honest. They're not going to, politely smile at another kid that they don't like and just be like, oh yeah, come play. We don't like you. I don't want to play with you. That's how they are. And so they're either going to get rejection from their kids or from adults. What do? You see a kid misbehaving somewhere, but you're out in public and it's not really acceptable to scowl at them or scold them. It's not your kid. And so you deal with it the best you can, and you just kind of put on a fake smile and say, oh, okay, he's such a sweet kid. But it's fake, right? So the kid is either going to experience absolute rejection from their friends, or they're going to experience fake smiles from other people, and they're never going to clue in beyond that age to, how am I supposed to act? Because this is what they've been fed their whole lives. And then we look at Eli's sons. Oh my goodness, what are they doing? Now, the first sin doesn't sound that intense, right? The whole meat thing with the fork. But back in Leviticus, I'm not sure exactly what chapter and verse it is, but back in Leviticus chapter 10, God explains what acceptable fire during a worship service is. Now, they could burn incense, which could come in a variety of different ways, but basically they'd get a water mixture of different oils and stuff that would smell good, and then they'd put burning coals from the altar under there so that the water would vaporize and then go out and make everything smell nice. It doesn't say where Aaron's sons got their fire from, but it says that they got unauthorized fire, and so God killed them. God sounds a little bit intense, doesn't he? And he is. when it comes to worship, right? Yeah.
I think we need to put it in like modern perspective. Think of the improperly taking their portion of the offering.
Hmm.
You can maybe equate that to Jim Baker pocketing a whole bunch of money. It was supposed to go to the church so that Tammy Faye had more money for makeup. You know what I'm saying? Not to mention, if they're playing slap and tickle with the girls in the thing, that's reminiscent of Stewart. James Stewart?
Mm. I'm
Swagger. Yeah. So, you know, like I said, I'm just trying to make like modern analogy.
No, it's good because even what is it in verse 25? No, it's earlier than that. At some point in these verses, God says, so or Eli says to his sons, if a man sins against another man, well, okay, God might come in and he might mediate for him. But if a man sins against God, how do you sin against God? How does a man sin against God as opposed to sinning against another man? Okay, and why? Why is there nobody to mediate between man and God if you sin against God? Well, which is exactly the answer that they give. So, I mean, if I come and I, kick you in the shin and ask you for an apology, well, then God comes in and he says, I paid for that sin and I forgive you for it. But here he's talking about priests in his church. You're not, now granted, every sin is a sin against God, ultimately, right? But as a priest or a pastor in the church, you're not sinning against other people when you do something like this, in some way maybe. But God is just pointing out the seriousness of, you are my representative. I don't care if you got unauthorized fire. That's as serious to me as anything else. I can't have you representing me if even the things that I've given you plain instructions for, you're going to deny and turn your back on. I can't have it. Which leads me to a question. Does God have higher standards for clergy? I see a couple yeses, a couple no's. Somebody want to explain a yes and somebody want to explain a no?
Well, as a pastor or clergy member, we're doing things that are going against God's word. We're creating stumbling blocks for the membership, so they see that.
Okay.
And they think to themselves, well, if the pastor is doing X, Y, and Z, then why can't I do X, Y, and Z? Or also, is the pastor really a man of God? Is this God thing real? This is what the pastor's doing. If he's stealing money from the collection plate or whatever it may be, if any of these sins are happening, it makes people question God.
Okay. Any pushback on that?
Pastors have to take an oath, don't they, to serve God
Mm-hmm.
and serve their congregations. And they're supposed to be up, more exactly an example.
Aren't all Christians called to do that?
Yes, they are.
But more so pastors, you're saying?
But pastors are human too.
Yeah, absolutely. Pastors are human too.
It seemed to me, I don't remember exactly which book, I thought it was Corinthians. Paul lays out a bunch of things, gifts and special things for all different kinds of vocations. And specifically, and I can't name all of them, but named some things for the overseers of the church as well.
Great. So I'll actually get to that. You got something to say first? Yeah, go ahead.
Chapter early in Ezekiel where you talk about the watchman. And that applies to all of us as believers. We all have a role as a watchman, and we all have a message of warning for those that are walking away from eternal salvation, away from God's gifts, promises, forgiveness, especially when we see particular, stubborn sin to be a watchman and share that message. But I believe we made particular application
Okay.
And that would be the role of pastor or worker, that they're the spokesperson of God's warning and
Sure.
watchman.
Yeah, I mean, so,
His people. And so the chapter talking about how if you fail to warn and they continue down this sinful path, that's on you.
right,
If you warn and they continue down this sinful path, that's on them.
right.
Now, it doesn't mean they're not responsible for their sins, but as a watchman, if you fail to warn, if you fail to speak, you're responsible for that.
Well, and that's, the question under chapter 2, verses 27 and through 36 on the right side of your page in the middle. Who's held responsible for the sins of Hophni and Phinehas? Who does God talk to? Eli. Doesn't go to Hophni and Phinehas. He goes to Dad, right? And so he's placing, like you said, the responsibility on the father, the priest, the one who was supposed to have been raising them in this way. Back to the question of, does God hold ministers to a higher standard? I thought I had, okay. Well, I think we had kind of consensus on that one, that yes, he does. Unless anybody wants some pushback on that. Yeah?
I would say not as much holds them to a higher standard, because even if, like God has said that every sin, no matter who you are, is equal in His eyes. So whether or not you are a pastor or you aren't a pastor,
Mm-hmm.
if you sin, God sees it as a sin.
Oh, yeah, and that's absolutely a valid point, and a good point to remember. I mean, yes, if you, the congregation, or a member of the congregation, sins, that's on you, right? But you're also under a shepherd, Pastor Cuck. And if that happens under his watch, and honestly, well, doesn't it seem like a little bit weird or even pathetic that Eli had to hear about the sins of his sons from other people? I've been hearing from all the people about how you've been sleeping around with the women of the church. How did you not know? You've been hearing from other people these sins? Pleading ignorance is not a valid excuse, which is the same thing for a pastor. I can't just plead ignorance because my X and Y member were doing whatever sins. That's why when you're calling a pastor and when you agree to be a member of a church, you are asking that guy, please keep me accountable to God's laws. I need you to check in on me. I want you to call me out for my sins. Call me out into the light. Don't let me do these things in the darkness. I want you to come and knock on my door and just ask me how things are going. Right? This is the relationship that you agree to when you become a member of a church in the sheep of a shepherd. And then on the opposite end of that spectrum, that's what he has agreed to accepting your call here, is I am here to shepherd you. I'm not going to let you walk off and be eaten by the wolves, by your own sinful flesh and the sins that you desire to do. I will always come out, whether it's with my staff or my rod, and I'm going to come back, I'm going to get you back. Whatever it takes. You can hate me for it, that's fine. But I'm not letting you walk away from Christ because of the sin. And you want that in a pastor so desperately. Same thing as you want that in a parent. The one who spares the rod despises his children. You don't spare the rod. Now, of course, on the other end, the shepherd is the representative of Christ who loved. You do this lovingly, always. It's not, with the fires of hell in your eyes or anything like that. It's because I have the light of heaven, and I can't see you walk out of that. Yeah.
You just made the connection that I was waiting for, because we're going back to where we started.
Mm-hmm.
Parenting application for those of us who are, or those of us who had parents. Wait, that's all of us.
Yep. Yeah.
Those of us who interact with other parents, who encourage other parents, even if, we're past having our own kids or haven't had our own kids.
Mm-hmm.
We encourage other parents, and sometimes the dad is called the pastor of the home, and sometimes the mom has to fill that
Yeah.
role. The dad isn't.
Yep.
So in that sense, the shepherd of the home.
Absolutely. And keep that thought in mind, because that's actually what we're going to end with. we'll maybe just kind of wrap up this question, and then we're going to, if there's anything else on the sheet or through chapter 2 that you want to ask about, we can talk about it briefly, but I know that we're kind of coming to the end of our time. Just hear what James chapter 3 says, is not many of you should become teachers, my fellow believers, because you know that we who teach will be judged more strictly. That's not James or God speaking through James just saying, oh, because he lives in a glass house and the other people will see what he's doing and know what's going on in his life. This is God saying, I will judge you more strictly. You want to be a pastor? You want to be a teacher and responsible for people's souls? This is what you're signing up for.
Would that include, by implication, do you want to be a parent?
Yeah,
Which then could go so far as to say this is one of the reasons the sixth commandment
100%.
is important, because when children are born to people who aren't thinking, am I ready to be a Christian parent?
Right.
There's a responsibility put on them they may not be prepared for.
Well, and this is, yeah, and biblically speaking, you are 100% correct. If you're going to walk into a marriage, you need to know that every time you commit the act, that can create children. Every time you have sex, you can have children. You know, no matter what kind of birth controls you're on, this is a possibility and actually the purpose for what's happening right now. And so you got to be ready the moment you ask for a woman's hand in marriage, right?
Or if you're patient in that way.
Yeah, that too. Right. But having that in your mind, I need to be prepared for this. Yes. So another question on that, are pastors' children held to a higher standard?
In the eyes of their peers, yes.
Right. In the eyes of peers, yes. 1 Timothy chapter 3 is where we get the what characteristics you need to have in order to be a pastor. He says, here's a trustworthy saying, if anyone sets his heart on being an overseer, he desires a noble task. Now the overseer must be above reproach, the husband of but one wife, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not given to drunkenness, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own family well and see that his children obey him with proper respect. So who's held to a higher standard? It's not the kids. Hopefully by dad. But in God's eyes, this is dad's responsibility again. Now, if your kids, are disobedient and like Hophni and Phinehas and you work wherever you work, that's not a good look, but you're not going to lose your job for it, right? As a pastor, you will. That disqualifies you from being a pastor. Now, granted, this is not like a cut and dried, this is what that looks like kind of thing, right? But this is a per context kind of thing too, right? This is something that the congregation has to be involved in. Okay, is there anything else on the sheet, the front of the sheet, that you want to get to before we jump to the graph in the back? Okay, then we're going to just finish off on the graph on the back. Now, I purposely left the descriptions for each of these bars blank, but you can see at the top, and I actually don't have a color copy. I think it's blue. Is blue on? Yeah, blue is church attendance, and then green is Bible class or Bible study attendance. And this is of children. Okay? So the habits of a child's parents almost exclusively will determine whether a kid goes to church or not for the rest of his or her life. Equally so, we'll focus on the blue bar. But I just put the green one in there so you can see. Now, on the far left, the big bar that's got the stripes through the top, that is the likely attendance of children if both mom and dad go to church every Sunday. The reason that the top 25% is shaded in is just to leave a little bit of room for the oddities children who do disobey anyway. The one immediately to the right of that is almost identical. The only reason it has an arrow going up to the top and it's not shaded in is just to show you that it's a different study. That is if dad always goes to church and mom never goes to church. What's significant between that bar and the one we just talked about? Yeah. Right, and like I explained, that's just to show those both are the same statistics. So if mom and dad take their kids to church every single Sunday, then the kids are 75 to 100% most likely going to go to church for the rest of their lives. Now, same thing with this one. If dad always goes but mom never comes, guess what the likelihood is? Again, 75 to 100%. Damien?
Yeah, I think what Stephen said here is that the faith life of our children is inexplicably tied to that.
Yeah. Because then we go on to the bar that is second from the right. That bar shows that around 60% of kids will continue going to church for the rest of their lives if mom always takes them to church and dad is more of like a maybe you've heard the term Creaster Christian. They go on Christmas and Easter. So mom always takes them to church and dad only comes on special occasions. It drops dramatically from 75 to 100% chance of going to church for the rest of their lives to more like 60. Now the last one, all the way on the right, is if mom takes her kids to church every single Sunday, but dad never goes. 2% chance. It's not none, but 2% chance. If dad doesn't take his kids to church, they're not going to church. And if they do, it's an absolute anomaly. And no matter what, if your kids grow up and are in faith, that is an absolute gift from God, right? I'm not going to take credit for that if my son does that. That is just a gift from God. And it's just exactly what Damien just said. It is just so important that men are men. That they step up and that they are the pastor of their household. That they show them this is what faith life looks like, right? This is how God set it up to be from the very beginning. And now, like I said, I have no idea anybody's story in here or anything like that, but this is the point where maybe that's something that could hit your conscience. Maybe this is something that down the line could hit mine. I'm sure that I will make mistakes, and mistakes will be made and have been made by everybody in this room. However, we still go back to, we still have a Father in heaven, right? The 2% chance is not none, and anomalies do happen. These are statistics that are taken by a big Baptist group that does a lot of religious and church studies like this frequently. But again, this is just the grace of God that there's any blue on this sheet, right? All of us were born dead in our sins. Dead. There should be no blue on this sheet at all, right? Dead people can't get up and walk to church. When you're spiritually dead, you don't want to come to church because it's the foolishness of God then. But by the grace of God and by the faith that He worked in your heart through hearing His word, through the waters of your baptism, He blessed you and He allowed you to come to this church. If He does the same for your children or their children, whatever, it's all by the grace of God. And thank you, God, for that. Thank you guys for having me today. I appreciate you allowing me to take up this time and spending this time with me. We'll end with a blessing. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of His Holy Spirit be and abide with you all. Amen.